Alright guys, welcome back to another one. So it's not too often that we get Jak Daxter news. The scene is obviously dry for the most part, although of course we have the wonderful Jak Daxter community, and especially the guys over at OpenGoal working on the native Jak ports, with Jak 3 development progressing smoothly, and hopefully we should see a release perhaps maybe sometime this year. But we did hear about something recently in regards to one of the greatest PSP games that graced the system, Daxter. Developed by Ready at Dawn and released in 2006, this was a standalone Daxter game that took place between the events of Jak 1 and Jak 2, to fill the gap as to what Daxter was getting up to during the time skip. And although this was the first Jak Daxter game that Naughty Dog weren't responsible for, it was actually really good.
Unlike this piece of
Recently, Andre Pacino, who is the co-founder of Ready at Dawn Games, went on the MinMaxx Podcast to talk all things about the studio. It's a really great podcast. It goes for about 2 hours and gives you some really neat insight towards the studio and their history. Now, Daxter was actually quite a large part of the conversation here between both Ben and Andre. For those who don't know, Daxter was the very first game that Ready at Dawn ever developed. Because a good portion of the team at the time were comprised of a lot of developers from Naughty Dog, it kind of made sense that this would be their very first step into the games industry. Now, there's a lot of different things that are brought up to do with Daxter here that's quite interesting, like how Sony, for a lot of the development of this game, just simply weren't satisfied with the project. And it was only because of their showcase at E3 2005 and the reception towards the demo they showed there, being that it was so positive, that completely changed Sony's minds on the project. Andre explains that they felt as if Ready at Dawn were in a position where they were only moments away from Sony pulling the plug entirely and scrapping Daxter. Now, while the feedback was mostly positive for Daxter at E3 2005, one thing that was said was that there was just simply too much going on in the game. And from the way that Andre was describing it, it sounded almost as if Daxter was bloated, a lot bigger and more ambitious than the final version we received. So apparently a lot of things were scrapped here. The world was a lot larger, there was a number of different things to do, probably 3 or 4 times the amount of mini-games planned, but for the game to not be overwhelming to the player, a lot of stuff had to be cut, and the level design approach had to be made a lot more linear. This makes me think that the team were originally trying to adapt Daxter into more of the larger open world-esque approach that both Jak 2 and Jak 3 took on. It also seems as if combat was going to be a little bit more in-depth as well, rather than the simplistic approach of just the spray gun and the fly swat. Andre mentioned that some of the feedback that was given was to have Daxter perform simplistic-based combat. So at one point, it seems as if the combat system tied to Daxter was a little bit more in-depth. The idea was to have fewer mechanics, but more systems built around those mechanics. And as we know, if you've played Daxter, how the levels are all designed specifically around the spray gun and the spray gun's hover mechanic, it made Daxter's approach to the platforming side of things so refreshing for a Jak game, as the platforming side of Jak and Daxter had kind of been lost, or at least it wasn't so much of the focus point when looking at Jak 2 and Jak 3. It was high when looking at the Precursor legacy, but Daxter brought back some of those old school feeling vibes we felt for that very first Jak game. However, by far the most interesting thing that was brought up in this interview is Daxter 2. Yeah, there was going to be a sequel to Daxter. Due to the success of the first game, Ready at Dawn were prepared to make a follow-up. But at the same time, Naughty Dog also noticed the success of Daxter on PSP, and they too also wanted to try their hat in making a Jak and Daxter PlayStation Portable game. When Ready at Dawn heard that Naughty Dog wanted to create a PSP Jak and Daxter game after the release of Daxter, this absolutely turned them off from wanting to pursue Daxter 2. Apparently, Sony said that, hey, that's fine, like, why don't both of you guys create new Jak and Daxter games for PSP? But Ready at Dawn had zero interest in a Daxter 2 if Naughty Dog were gearing up to make their own Jak and Daxter PSP title. So they decided to pursue their next project, which was God of War Chains of Olympus, and still to this day, this is their most successful game so far. Now, as we all know, there was never a Naughty Dog developed Jak and Daxter game that ever happened. The reason why this never ended up happening with Naughty Dog was because they attempted to try port Jak and Daxter's game engine to develop this Jak game onto the PSP, but unfortunately it was not functional at all, and I'm assuming that the studio probably wouldn't want to take up resources to try optimize that engine to work functionally on the PSP, and rather just put all of their time into Uncharted 2. So rather than a Naughty Dog developed Jak PSP game,
we got this piece of shit in 2009!
If you look at it though, if we were to have received a Daxter 2, there's a good chance that God of War Chains of Olympus and the follow-up, Ghost of Sparta, may have never have happened. We also know that Ready at Dawn in 2008, the same year Chains of Olympus came out, also did the Okami Wii port. And to be fair, I think the timeline that we currently have for Ready at Dawn, at least looking in their earlier years of developing video games, is sort of the golden timeline. Their highest rated games are from 2006 to 2011. They had 5 really good years. The Order 1886, although it does have a 63 out of 100 on Metacritic, I think it is most certainly underrated. It's not the greatest game ever, but it certainly accumulated a bit of a cult following in the years past, and I know to this day people are asking for a sequel. But it's pretty hard knowing that we've lost out on 3 Jak and Daxter titles now: the untitled Naughty Dog developed PSP game Daxter 2, and of course Jak 4. Who knows, Daxter 2 could have been even better than what we got with Daxter 1, or it could have been a complete flop. If you had the chance, would you really want to give up Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta to receive Daxter 2? In my opinion, as much as I love Jak and Daxter, I'd probably have to go with a no on that one, as I loved Chains of Olympus and Ghost of Sparta so much. They're at the highest ratings for Ready at Dawn's games for a very good reason. Andre actually mentioned in this interview that in total there's been about 24 projects that have taken place throughout Ready at Dawn's history, though we know that only 11 of these have actually seen the light of day. One of these was actually going to be a Ubisoft title, and it's speculated that work on this began around 2008 to 2009, but apparently Ready at Dawn pulled out of developing this project as Ubisoft consistently demanded too many changes, and one of these changes being the switch of a woman as the main protagonist, demanding that they make the main protagonist a man. As at the time, Ubisoft were led to believe that from a business standpoint, the game is going to perform better if we have a male main protagonist. Ready at Dawn didn't agree with this at all and pulled out of developing the project. Honestly, this interview is really great, especially if you've got interest in Ready at Dawn and their history. I highly recommend it. I'll leave the link to it in the description down below. It's always great to get some Jak and Daxter news, even if this is more on the sadder end of the spectrum. It is still some really interesting history. Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's video. Slap that like button, hit the subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons. I hope all of you guys are having a fantastic day, and we'll talk again real soon.